So today, we're in the second week of our series that I've titled When God Died. And what we're doing in this series for a couple of weeks, and we'll continue on with the thoughts a little bit next week at our brunch, just want us to remember the suffering of Jesus. Remember what Jesus went through. And I want us to do this to kind of help prepare our hearts for Easter. So I was at a conference in downtown Seattle a few weeks back, and at this conference, there was this Jewish scholar, and he had a question posed to him. It was on video, but we watched this Jewish scholar, very well-known guy, but I unfortunately can't remember who he was. But he was a Jewish scholar. He was a Jew, and he was very versed in Torah and all that good stuff. And he said something in this conference that really grabbed my attention. The question was posed to him just sort of off the cuff. The interviewer asked him, if you had to summarize Judaism, the Jewish faith, in one word, what would it be? If you had to summarize the Jewish faith in one word, what would it be? I mean, how would you answer that question? Like, let's do it. How would you summarize your faith in one word if you had to do it? Hope, it's good, yeah. Grace, it's good, yeah. Jesus, yeah, good. Love? I mean, Jesus is like the right answer to every question ever like that, so that's always good. That's always good. One word, could you do it? Sacrifice, yeah. So yeah, okay, so you can see it's kind of hard though, right? We have several different words and all that. So anyway, they asked this Jewish scholar, if you had to summarize the Jewish faith in one word, what would you say? And so the scholar was quiet, like he got quiet for a minute. And you could tell he was a deep thinker because he did this. He was like, he tilted his head back and he closed his eyes and he kind of, And there's that moment where I was wondering, like, okay, is he going to say anything? And then his eyes popped open, he tilted his head back up, he looked at the interviewer, and he said really clearly and really intentionally, he said, remember. He said, if I had to summarize the entire Jewish religion in one word, I would summarize it as the word remember. Now, of all the words that he could have used, he chose the word remember. Remember. And that's a theme really throughout the entire Old Testament. Remember what God has done. Remember who you are, Israel, as his people. Remember what he has promised to do for you. Remember. Now, I don't know what one word I would use to summarize following Jesus, but since Jewish belief is a huge part of Christianity, it's probably a word that we should take to heart too, this word remember. Remember. In fact, today that's what we're going to do. We're going to remember Jesus. We're going to remember the suffering of Jesus, and we're going to take communion together today as a reminder and do it in remembrance of Jesus, because no one has ever suffered like Jesus suffered. Let's turn in Matthew. Turn to Matthew chapter 27. It's the first book of the New Testament. Matthew 27. We're going to prepare our hearts for communion today by remembering the death of Jesus. We started it last week, and we're continuing on this week in part 2 of When God Died. Matthew chapter 27, and we're going to start in verse 27. So Matthew 27, 27. We're going to read a few verses here out of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 27. Starting in verse 27, the Gospel reads like this. The Gospel says, Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus to the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him, and then they led him away to crucify him. Guys, the greatest tragedy and the greatest victory that the world has ever known was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The tragedy and the victory that took place when God in the flesh, Jesus, the Messiah, the one who created the universe, died for humanity. When the Creator died for his creation. And I want us to remember this morning, because we get so used to it. And our hearts grow cold at this story. Our hearts grow cold towards these verses. We grow cold to the cross. We grow cold to the price that was paid for our sin. We grow cold to the gospel. So remember. Let's remember today. Remember the suffering. Remember the heartache. Remember the cross. Remember what Jesus really did. Let's remember together today. Think about it like this. We don't tend to think a lot about Jesus growing up, but think about as Jesus grew up as a young man. He knew from a very young age that he was born to die. He knew what his purpose was. He knew that he was going to suffer on the cross. In Psalm 88:15, David said, I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. And David probably didn't know it at the time, but that was a foreshadowing of Jesus. I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. Think about that. From the time he was basically a boy, Jesus knew that his destiny was to die for the sin of humanity. Think about what that must have been like growing up in his dad's carpenter shop. Right? His dad was a carpenter. Jesus was a carpenter growing up. Every time he and his dad took a crossbeam and set it up so that they could work on it, it would remind him of the cross that he would suffer and die on at the age of 33. Every time Jesus drove a nail into a plank, he had to be reminded that one day nails would be driven through his own quivering palms on the cross. He lived his entire life in the shadow of the cross. Remember. Let's remember that together today. Last week we talked about some of the atrocities that Jesus endured. We talked about how they stripped him naked. And maybe we didn't talk about that last week, but you know, you always see the pictures of Jesus on the cross, and he's got like a loincloth or something covering him. That's for the kids. That's for the sake of the children. In reality, he was stripped naked and hung naked, humiliated on the cross for everyone to see. They stripped him down. They had some psychopathic, barrel-chested Roman soldier who was probably a volunteer for the job come and take a long whip called the cat of nine tails whip and lacerate the body of Jesus with it. Remember. Remember. Ribbons of flesh hung from his body when they were done with him. The cat of nine tails whip would have little bits of bone and metal and glass embedded into the end of the whip so that when they used it on the prisoner, it would embed itself into the person's flesh. It would wrap around their body, embedding itself into their flesh, and then they would yank it out. Many times it would actually kill the person right there because it would literally disembowel them alive. Most times a person who received a scourging like Jesus did at the hands of the Romans would not be able to walk afterwards. The Romans were incredibly skilled at execution and in torture. They knew how to punish a man within an inch of his life. And oh, how they punished our Jesus. Remember how they punished him. No one has ever known suffering like Jesus. The Bible says his face was so marred from the beating and the abuse that he didn't even look like a person when they were done with him. He looked like some kind of animal. Remember. Who would do such a thing to Jesus? You know, when you read the story, it's easy to like point your finger at the Jews or point your finger at the Romans or point your finger at Pilate, the governor, or any number of people. But within the story of his crucifixion and the story of his suffering, I think we see something deeper at work than just the characters in the story. I think when we really start looking at why Jesus was crucified on that day, the story becomes a mirror of us. It becomes a mirror of our own lives. And if you've been in church any amount of time, or you went to a Christian school growing up, or anything like that, you've heard at some point that you crucified Jesus, I crucified Jesus, we crucified Jesus. But what does that really mean? Because we weren't there. You know, we weren't there. How is it that we crucified Jesus? Well, I think that the actual account of the crucifixion is an interesting character study. Because in the story of the crucifixion, we see some types of people that led Jesus to the cross. We see some types of people that are still around today. Because I believe that times change, but I believe that people, we really don't change. We're not so different from the people who lived 2,000 years ago in Jesus' day. We're not so different from the people who stood around and watched him suffer and bleed and die on the cross. We're not so different. And so I think that in the story of his suffering and the crucifixion, we see 6 types of people who killed him. And in these 6 types of people, we see us. We see ourselves. And as I mentioned these 6 types of people this morning, I want you to remember what Jesus endured, and sincerely ask yourself as we go through this together, am I one of those people? Am I one of those people? Are any of their attitudes prevalent in my own life? So just briefly this morning, I want to touch on the 6 people who killed Jesus. Are you ready? The first person, and this is the first blank in your notes, the first person who killed Jesus was the self-righteous person. The self-righteous person. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 in Matthew 27. It says, early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Who made the plans? The religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the chief priests. These were the people who thought they were good enough on their own, so they didn't need a Messiah. They didn't need Jesus. They had so many laws, and they kept so many laws. They kept so many laws to reassure themselves of how good they were, of how they were so much better than everyone else. They kept the Sabbath like nobody's business. They kept this, like if they got something stuck in their shoe, they would take it out before Saturday, before the Sabbath, so they wouldn't be accused of carrying a burden, right, on the Sabbath, because that was against their laws that they made up. They wouldn't kill a mosquito on Saturday because that was the Sabbath, and they didn't want to be accused of hunting on the Sabbath. So mosquitoes were off limits and insects were off limits. And that's laughable, right? I mean, it's funny, but that's how religious they were. They were so strict and so religious and so self-righteous, and they crucified Jesus. They thought they were morally superior to everybody else, and they sent Jesus to his death. See, here's the truth, and this is what's true for our lives. When you pride yourself on how close you are to God, chances are you're as far away from him as you've ever been. When you pride yourself on how close you are to God compared to everyone else around you, chances are you are as far from him as you ever have been, and you don't even realize it. We still struggle with this, don't we? We still struggle with this. Like, let's get real here for a second. Have you ever wondered what a church full of Pharisees would look like? A church full of these kind of people? I'll tell you what it would look like. First of all, everybody would be at church every Sunday. Everybody would give their tithe every week. Everybody would work and serve in the church. And you know what else? Every one of them would go to hell. That's self-righteousness. That's the heart of the Pharisee, when we're so concerned about our law keeping that we miss Jesus. The point is this: everything can look good on the outside, but Jesus said that self-righteous people are like graves on the inside. They're just full of dead stuff. They're just full of dead stuff. The self-righteous person killed Jesus. And I have to ask, are you a self-righteous person? Have you ever truly been broken at the foot of the cross? Have you ever truly been grieved over your sinfulness? Self-righteousness crucified Jesus. Is there a shred of that in you this morning? Because I think if we were truly honest, all of us would have to confess that there may be a shred of that running through every one of our hearts. And apart from Jesus, and apart from throwing ourselves completely upon His mercy and His grace and His work on the cross, we're no better than the Pharisees. The second person who killed Jesus was the hypocrite. The hypocrite. Look in verse 3, Matthew 27. It says, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Now, there's no doubt about it. Judas was a first-class hypocrite. Judas sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He was one of the 12 disciples. He went with them and did everything and saw the miracles and healed people. So he had the admiration of many, many people. In fact, the disciples made him the treasurer of their little organization. Now, you think about that. Who do you make the treasurer of your organization? The one you have the most confidence in, right? The person you trust the most, the person who's the most dependable. They made Judas the treasurer, but he betrayed Jesus. Hypocrisy crucified Jesus. And as we get ready to take communion this morning, I want you to look into your own heart and ask yourself, is there hypocrisy in me? See, because you don't have to betray Jesus with 30 pieces of silver or a kiss. All you have to do is pretend that you're better than you really are. All you have to do is pretend that you're better than you really are. You just have to fake it. And let's be honest, it's easy to fake it. It's easy to pretend to love Jesus. That's why our first core value as a church is authenticity. We have a little saying, no perfect people allowed, because we know that we can't afford to go through life together faking it and pretending that we've got it all together, because none of us do. And we've just got to be open and honest, confessing that, hey, I'm a little messed up, you're a little messed up, let's be messed up together, and let's love Jesus. We can't afford to fake it. Hypocrisy, self-righteousness. I'll tell you a third type of person in this chapter that really speaks to my heart. Look in verse 11. It says, meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? You have said so, Jesus replied. Now Pilate, this is Pilate speaking, he was not an idiot. He understood why the chief priests and the scribes wanted Jesus dead. They were jealous of him. They were envious of him. That's why they hated him. That's why they had hate in their heart towards him. And you know, for Pilate, you don't get to be a good politician without really understanding the motives of people and what motivates people. So he knew why these people wanted to kill Jesus. But what did he do? Look in verse 24. It says, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and he washed his hands in front of the crowd, and he said, I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. All the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. And then he released Barabbas to them. But he had Jesus flogged with the cat of nine-tail whip and handed him over to be crucified. What kind of person was Pilate? Pilate was a coward. The coward crucified Jesus. The coward killed Jesus. Pilate knew what was going on. He wasn't ignorant. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. He knew that the people hated Jesus for no good reason. But Pilate was a really good politician too. And he knew that to be a good politician and to get ahead as a politician, you've got to flip-flop all the time. And you've got to give the people what they want. He wasn't going to stick his neck out for this rabbi named Jesus. Honestly, Pilate had an easy job, and whatever paid his bills determined his conduct. He was a coward. So before I take communion this morning, I have to ask myself, I have to look inside myself and ask myself, Stephen, are you willing to stand up for Jesus when it might cost you something? Are you afraid of what the crowd might say about you? Are you afraid that people might point their fingers at you if they don't like something you say? Or what if you have to suffer to stand up for Jesus? Are you willing to do that? Because if you're not willing to suffer, Stephen, you have in your heart an attitude of cowardliness that sent Jesus to the cross. Self-righteousness crucified him. Hypocrisy crucified him. Cowardliness crucified him. And then fourthly, I want you to look at verse 20. Verse 20 says that the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. The fourth person who killed Jesus was the conformist. The conformist. Who are these people? These are the people who were just sort of there in the crowd. They didn't know their right hand from their left, and they just sort of went along with what everybody else was saying. And Pilate stands before the people with Jesus on one hand and Barabbas on the other, and there's going to be an election. Are we going to release Barabbas, or are we going to release Jesus, who's done nothing? And the chief priests and the elders go out into this crowd of conformists, and they start telling them, hey, now, guys, listen. We're all together on this thing. We're all on the same side. Jesus is not on our side. Jesus is the bad one. And I know that, Barabbas is an insurrectionist. He's a murderer. He's a thief. But Jesus is the dangerous one. We need to ask for Barabbas to be released. And the people, what do? They just go along with it. They let it happen. They conform. Conformity. They're squeezed in by public opinion. And they're persuaded to go along with the multitude. Like if you were to interview them 2,000 years ago, if you were to stick a microphone in their face and ask them, hey, why did you elect Barabbas? And you ask them, most of them would probably be like, I don't know. It's just what everybody else was doing. I mean, that's what our public servants told us to do, so I did it. That was the prevailing public sentiment, so I went along with it. Conformity. The Bible says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And here's where this hits home for us. Do we have what it takes to stand for Jesus when public opinion is against us? At school, or in the boardroom, or on the assembly line, do you have what it takes to stand alone if need be, no matter what everyone else is doing? Or will you simply conform? Conformity, the conformist crucified Jesus. Are you a conformist? And then look at verse 36. Here's the fifth kind of person. Verse 36 says, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. This is while he's on the cross. Luke 23:35, skipping ahead to Luke. Luke says that the people stood around the cross watching. They stood around watching. Jesus is up there dying in agony and blood, and they're not spitting on him. They're not driving the nails into his hands. They're not Pilate or the Pharisees or the chief priests. These are just the bystanders. They're just standing here watching an innocent man die. Who are these people? These are the indifferent. The indifferent people killed Jesus. Just spectators. Just watching as an innocent man was put to death. Just watching and not doing anything about it. Not caring one way or the other. How many people show up like this in churches every week? We come because our wife dragged us here. Or we come because it makes us feel good. Or we come on Sunday, but our faith really doesn't touch us the rest of the week. We believe, but we never really give a thought to the people in our lives who are desperate for Jesus. And here's the thing. These people standing around the cross and watching, these were not bad people. They weren't bad people. They were probably decent, everyday people. Most of them probably didn't even have anything against Jesus. Maybe they were just weak-minded. Maybe they were just busy and they wanted to get on with their day. Maybe they just didn't have time for Jesus, so they stood there and they watched him. And they just watched him as he died. Now let's bring this down to a really, really personal level. And I don't say this, please hear me, I don't say this to make you feel guilty. at all. That's not my heart, and I hope that you'll see my heart in this. I hesitate to even bring this up, but okay, I want to make this personal in our lives. Last week, and even today, I stood up here before I preached, and I encouraged all of us to think about someone that we might bring to church to hear the gospel on Easter Sunday. I talked about how I'm going to give a simple gospel invitation. I'm going to give a simple message. I'm going to call on people who don't know Jesus to put their faith in Jesus for the first time. Honestly, how many of you invited somebody to Easter this week? Don't raise your hands. How many of you invited somebody? Beyond that, honestly, how many of you even gave it a second thought once you left this place? You see how easy it is to slip into indifference? We just get on with our lives, and we're indifferent. And maybe that rubs you the wrong way because you're like, Stephen, stop trying to guilt me into inviting people to church. Please hear me. That's not my heart in this. I'm just trying to make it personal. I do, though, want you to understand how important what we do here in this room week in and week out is. Guys, you never know what people are going through. You have no idea what's going on in people's hearts and lives when they come in here. And what we do here on Sundays is we try to connect with God, and we seek to connect with God's heart and connect with each other. And every week we do our best to lift up Jesus. And every week, heaven and hell are in the balance for some of you. Because you never know what kind of hell people have to go home to. You have no idea. Not too long ago, someone asked me to pray for their daughter who was on drugs. Not too long ago, someone asked me to pray for their kid who they found drugs in their kid's backpack. Not too long ago, someone I found out is hurting themselves. You have no idea the hell that people are going through every day. And they come. They come into this place on Sundays. All of us, broken and imperfect people, we come. They come through these doors at Northwood Middle School. They come looking for something. They come looking for acceptance. They come looking for hope. Really, whether they realize it or not, they come looking for Jesus. Don't ever buy into the lie that what we do here isn't important. Do you hear my heart now? Like, it's not about guilting you, it's about people. You don't know what people are going through. Let's not be indifferent about bringing people to hear about Jesus. Let's not be indifferent about bringing people to hear the hope of the gospel. We cannot be indifferent about this, church. We've got to live and die by it, that Jesus really is worth hearing about, that Jesus really is worth bringing people to hear about. The people stood watching. Indifference. Indifferent people killed Jesus. And last of all, look in verse 39. Verse 39 says, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from that cross if you are the Son of God. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he trusts him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Who are these people that are mocking Jesus? These are the cynics. The cynic killed Jesus. Cynicism. They mocked him as he died. They didn't just let him die in peace. They made fun of him while he bled. They made fun of him while he suffered and was in agony. They mocked him. The cynic. Are you cynical about spiritual things? Are you cynical about church? Are you cynical about Christianity? Are you cynical about people? See, I really believe that cynicism is the great sin of our generation. Our culture is so full of cynics. See, skepticism's one thing. Like, I can appreciate healthy skepticism. We want to poke and prod and ask, okay, is this true? Is this right? That's a good thing. But cynicism is something completely different. A cynic believes that nothing is really true and that there's no one really to trust except myself. A cynic believes that nothing's really true and that they can only trust themselves. Oscar Wilde said that a cynic is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. That's the cynic. And it was that kind of attitude that crucified Jesus. They mocked him as he died. And as I looked at this chapter, as I look at the story of the crucifixion, I can't help but think, wow, these are really terrible people. These are really terrible attitudes to have. But you know what? I see myself in every one of these people. Every one of them. That's how messed up I am. I see myself in every single one of these types of people. And Jesus suffered, and Jesus bled, and Jesus died. And these are the kinds of people that put him on the cross. And we still are. And when I come to take communion, I don't want the things that crucified him to have a place in my heart. And I hope that you don't either. When we come to have communion together, it's an act of remembering what Jesus did and refocusing all of our lives on him. On his life and death on the cross. So today we're going to take communion together. And we're going to remember Jesus together. And I want you to stand as we read a scripture together right now. David, will you come back up and play softly for us? I read this scripture every time we take communion. But today I want to read it from the Message paraphrase of the Bible so that hopefully we can hear it with new ears. Listen to the words here of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. This is the Apostle Paul writing. He writes, "Let me go over with you again exactly what goes on in the Lord's Supper and why it is so centrally important. I received my instructions from the Master himself and passed them on to you. The Master, Jesus, on the night of his betrayal, took bread. Having given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, broken for you. Do this to remember me.' After supper, he took the cup and did the same thing with the cup. 'This cup is my new blood, my new covenant with you. Each time you drink this cup, remember me.'" What you must solemnly realize is that every time you eat this bread and every time you drink this cup, you reenact in your words and actions the death of the Master. You will be drawn back to this meal again and again until the Master returns. You must never let familiarity breed contempt. Let's not allow our familiarity with the story of the crucifixion, our familiarity with Jesus, our familiarity with the gospel, our familiarity with church and Sundays and everything that we get so wrapped up in, let's never let that become what saves us. Let's never let it breed contempt within our hearts. It's always, always, always about Jesus. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, as we do, come down the middle aisle here and then filter back up the sides. Take a piece of bread and a cup and hold it with you when you get back to your seat. And we're going to take it together today to remember Jesus. So would you come now?